Oh, okay. So out in the fields.
Yeah, in a gravel pit. He has a hill, and he's got a gravel pit being dug out of it.
Go figure. You go back to your dad's place and he puts you to work in the gravel pits.
Yeah, it's pretty typical, but it's great for shooting. It's a
Yeah,
perfect shooting range.
yeah, and killing.
Yep, exactly.
Can bury the bodies afterwards.
hmm
The basic needs of your average martial artist.
hmm
All right, guys, we are here on episode 13 of You, Me, and Us. I've got a very cool guest in Logan Bruneau today. He's a longtime training partner of mine, good friend, and also relevant to this upcoming conversation is an incredibly knowledgeable historian when it comes to martial arts in general and has taught me just a hell of a lot when it comes to grappling and jiu-jitsu and judo and the whole background as far as history is concerned, because to be honest, a lot of grapplers and jujitsuka in general, I find, don't really know their own history or just very brief bullet points. So this is going to be a very illuminating conversation, I think, for most people who are watching it. So thank you very much, Logan, for coming on. How's it going today?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing great.
Right on. So we were chatting a little bit the other day, going over some of the finer points here and there of the conversation we're going to have today. And I'm going to tell you, I was getting super excited. Like I could have recorded that as a podcast. I was getting hype for it.
It's cool stuff.
Yeah, we want to, just for the sake of simplicity, for a lot of, there's going to be a lot of information coming at people that they may not have a lot of grasp on. So I want to try to keep it as chronological as possible as we go
Right.
throughout it. So in that spirit, where would you feel comfortable starting this? Because we could go back all the way to Greece if you wanted.
You're right. Well, we could look back as a retrospect and then come forward, basically.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Just like you said, a lot of people, uh, they train martial arts, whatever martial art they train, they don't know the history of their martial art, which is funny because the history of martial arts are very interconnected, as we're going to find out right away. And um, the history of martial arts is really the history of humanity. It's the history of human development because martial arts have developed parallel with humans. Most martial arts schools give a very brief history of what their martial art is. Unfortunately, with Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, what most people know is that they might say something like Helio Gracie was the founder of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and that he had added leverage to Japanese Jiu Jitsu to make it Gracie Jiu Jitsu. And that's all you need to know. That's what a lot of people would say. And there's so much more to it than that. Um, a lot of people might know that Brazilian Jiu Jitsu comes from Judo. Some people might not. That might be the first surprise. But yeah, it is heavily rooted in Judo. And in fact, a lot of grappling arts today are heavily rooted in Judo. Um, People think that Asian martial arts come from China, more specifically from the Shaolin Temple, because that's where a lot of martial arts origin stories in Asian martial arts come from. If you look at karate, taekwondo, different styles of kung fu, they all kind of point back at the Shaolin Temple. But the Shaolin Temple was built in around 500 AD. That's not that long ago in the history of humans. In China, we know that the Art of War, written by Sun Tzu, that was written BC,
Hmm.
a long, like centuries before the Shaolin Temple was even constructed. So obviously they were practicing martial arts before that in China, and we have records in China from that date back to almost 3000 BC to reference to some kind of martial arts contests or battles, right?
Wow. So not only were there martial arts long before the Shaolin Temple, but Sun Tzu's The Art of War is still today considered like one of the high forms of philosophy when it comes to martial war.
Exactly. In fact, the Shaolin Temple is as old today as Lao Tzu's Art of War would have been roughly around the time they built the Shaolin Temple.
Wow.
It's a really old book, right? And then the people, the Shaolin Temple origin story goes back even further, saying that martial arts came from India when a traveling Indian monk named Bodhidharma brought his kind of own sect of Buddhism which emphasized physical exercise, so that they weren't just sitting around doing meditation and eating vegetables. They're also practicing martial arts techniques and exercising.
Was this related to yoga in some way?
Probably, yeah, probably. I mean, I don't know if there's a direct connection to yoga, but it was probably quite similar, yogic exercises, if you will. And at some point during various different military conflicts that took place in central China, the government tried to, oppress the people. From time to time, they'd attack the Shaolin monastery directly, and the monks were able to use superior fighting skills in close range combat to defend the local farmers and their own temple. So that's where the popularity of the Shaolin temple's lineage comes from. And in China, you might have hundreds of styles that claim a lineage dating back to the Shaolin temple. Whether or not that's even true, because it was just kind of the popular thing to slap a label onto. It's like if you walk through a Chinese market today and you buy a pair of Gucci sunglasses for $10.
Yeah,
that's not Gucci, but they slapped a label on it because it sounds good.
Yeah, people don't buy it if you don't.
Exactly. So if you're a martial arts instructor a few hundred years ago in China, you say that origins come from the Shaolin temple. And sometimes they probably did. But that's definitely not the origin of martial arts. It was just like a very popular origin story. But even before, that was around 500 AD, like I said. And we know that in China, martial arts have been around since around 3000 BC at least, as old as Chinese civilization is. But if you were to look around the world, some of the oldest, like for example, there's hieroglyphics in, I think, Syria, at Beni Hassan. I think it's in Syria. These hieroglyphics depict very complex martial arts movements, spears, grappling techniques, striking techniques, swords, axes, bows, you name it. And the entire system of martial arts, those hieroglyphics would have dated back to 3500 BC, probably.
Yeah, I remember
so over 5,000 years ago.
I remember you showing me pictures of that a while ago, and I was blown away because when you said hieroglyphics, I was expecting like stick people cave arts from North America for some reason, but it looked more similar to like Egyptian, like full color people doing things.
Yeah, complex movements. And although the images, because it wasn't, the Renaissance period, they didn't really know how to properly draw the human body. Some of it's a little bit abstract looking, but it's clear that they were depicting combat techniques, close range combat techniques, and a melee of fighting. So that, I think, is the oldest recorded martial arts system that we've seen in the world, and that's Syria, which is no surprise because that's where a lot of humans came from, right? And if you were to look a little bit after that through the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, you're going to find that they all also had martial arts techniques heavily embedded in their society. For example, the Romans wouldn't have taken over the world. I mean, we're talking about militaries that are based heavily on close range combat. They didn't have guns. They did have ranged weapons, but training your armies in martial arts would have been of the utmost importance. One of my personal theory, this is an interesting one. This is just conjecture. This is not something that I've read a little bit about it, but it's not something that's really historically fact or anything. Is that if you look at Muay Thai, for example, they're clearly doing striking. The striking aspects of it may have been from the Shaolin Temple. Maybe its origins are in Chinese Kung Fu. But Southeast Asian martial arts like Muay Thai have grappling systems that are reminiscent of Greco-Roman wrestling. Why would they have grappling? Like if you look at the plum clinch, the Thai clinch, or when they shoot double underhooks and get a body lock, and their takedowns, the upper body grappling is reminiscent of Greco-Roman wrestling. I think that maybe they have such a strong Greco-Roman looking foundation because it's literally a Greco-Roman foundation. It could have been that 2,000 years ago when the Romans were in Southeast Asia, which we know that they were.
Yeah, Alexander the Great, right?
Exactly, Alexander the Great. When he was up there stabbing phalanges up people's buttholes, he may have also had his soldiers teaching hand-to-hand combat techniques, and what was also probably a sport at the time.
Sure.
Right? It was probably already a sport to do grappling and wrestling. And I mean, the Olympic Games had already existed. Pankration had already existed. This was probably around the time that they were constructing the Colosseum. So we know that it was already a sport. By the way, gladiators in the Colosseum didn't always fight to the death.
Right.
It was very much a sport. So a lot of these guys were like modern MMA athletes, and from time to time they did die, way more often than ours do. but they were supposed to be combat athletes. So yeah, I mean, it was a sport, and there's a good chance that I personally believe that there's a chance that Muay Thai grappling, the Greco-Roman aspect of it, it looks like Greco-Roman wrestling because it probably is Greco-Roman wrestling.
Mm.
Yeah.
So moving forward, then we've covered, like you're saying, retrospectively all the way back to Syria, and we're getting back more towards the Eastern Asian roots that people will be more familiar with.
That's right. I mean, we followed it from Asia almost back to Europe, which a lot of people would be surprised by. That you think martial arts, you think Asian, but the truth is martial arts around the world, they didn't come from one place. They may have started in one original place where there was hunter-gatherer tribes in Syria, but ultimately martial arts arose from our need to survive. We had to use our hunting skills and our survival skills, meld that into combat skills, usually with things like spears, bows and arrows, and axes and knives. Later on, developing things like swords, which are specifically for combat. And once we went into the Bronze Age around the world, we started erecting cities and farms and agriculture about 10, 12,000 years ago. And once those started coming up, we had to start opening schools or gyms or just military bastions to teach martial arts to soldiers, and then later on to civilians for the purpose of self-defense, and later on sport, right? So yeah, this one of the martial arts around the world was jiu-jitsu, and it was from Japan. Where it came from originally, it's hard to say. Japan has been developing as like a medieval society since around 500 AD. It's not super old. 2,000 years ago, it was full of Aboriginal people, and since then has been taken over by a different race, you would say, that we know of as the modern Japanese, that came over from China and Korea, and they developed, a society, and it became a warrior society around 1000 AD. The samurai class started to take over. They didn't call themselves a samurai, but they were the warrior class. In many cultures, the warrior class are peasants, but in some cultures, the warrior class are the nobles. And in Japan, the warrior class became the nobles. In most cases, they became the nobles by force. Mm-hmm. They realized that they outnumber everybody else, and they know how to fight, and they have the tools to do it. So they took over by force. And whereas the emperor in Japan was he was a figurehead, it was actually the warlords, known as the shoguns, who had actual total power. And they just used the emperor as a figurehead. But technically they were under the emperor in rank, but they were more powerful than the emperor in their decision making.
So would the shogun then be the only ones with martial skills being disseminated?
You mean like martial arts techniques?
Yeah, would they be keeping that within their own rank?
They would, but it wasn't like the shogun wasn't necessarily the best martial artist. He would have been, he was a military leader. He wasn't necessarily the best fighter. He was a military leader, although some of them were renowned fighters. But the shoguns would hire the best warrior to teach the next generation of best warriors. So that's where these different schools of martial arts started to develop within Japan. You know what I mean? Like, imagine if you're a military leader and you want to develop the best spear fighters. You want these guys to be really good with a spear, but they're not just good with a spear. You also want them to be good with archers. You want them to be good on horseback. You want them to be good swimmers. And you want them to be good with all the different things that pertain to war. So there would be masters in these different fields. Some people were masters of several fields, and some schools would kind of specialize in certain fields.
Yeah, you see some of these old Japanese styles that specialize in fighting with an oar, strange things like that.
That's right. So the most common ones, and there were hundreds of them, there were hundreds of martial arts schools, but the most common ones were spear or halberd, sword, Horseback riding was huge. Knowledge of survival techniques was huge. But we're talking about martial arts. So specifically in
Mhm.
terms of martial arts, it was obviously mostly based on weapons. Understanding the sword. The sword was actually, it took a back seat in martial arts training during the times of war. It was mostly people were practicing the spear or the
Hmm.
halberd, and the bow and arrow. The bow and arrow was the number one killer in ancient Japan,
Yeah,
and it
they
was
had.
usually used on horseback.
Did they not have a pretty technical longbow?
So yeah, they had a super technical longbow, and I don't really understand. It's called kyudo. Japanese bowmanship is called kyudo. Their archery style. I don't understand how it works. I'm not a huge archer, but it is different from the English classical longbow. I'm not going to say it's better. I don't know about that, but it's different. If you look at it, I mean, the
Hmm.
thing is like twice as tall as they are for one.
Yeah, I remember seeing a short clip of it in that Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai, and I was like,
Yeah,
how the hell big is that thing? That's gotta be 12 foot tall.
yeah, they're huge bows, hey, a very long bow. But in any case, these martial arts styles, they so you would have had a military leader or commander or a shogun hire the best samurai. It was either based on sometimes it was based on just his rank, but it was usually based on like maybe his tournament statistics. Maybe he would come out of a tournament, or he'd win a few duels, or he just collected a lot of necks in war. They call it neck collecting when you like bring back a bag full of heads. And if he collected some heads of some warriors that were well known from another province, then he's more likely to be able to get a bigger fiefdom, and maybe might get a mansion. He'll have a dojo. He'll instruct his students. They'll instruct their students, and he's going to be making some money in the forms of basically like a rice donation from the shogun,
Okay,
so
so
he could feed his people.
what part of history are we at right now?
We are at medieval Japan during, I would say, the Sengoku era, which is around 1500 AD, only around 500 years ago.
Okay, so would the style, I guess, eclectic though it may be at that point, be defined as Budo?
Yeah. Well, by today's standards, we would call it Budo. They wouldn't have called it Budo back then. It's similar to the way that if you read Shakespeare, that's only a few hundred years ago, but the English is totally different. They use different words, right?
Hmm.
And I'm not a master of the Japanese language, but I doubt that most of the words that they're using in martial arts today are what they used back then. And in Japanese martial arts, there's two kind of different classifications of martial arts in the timeline. There's like modern martial arts and there's classic martial arts. Anything after roughly the 1880s is considered a modern martial art. So judo, kendo, um, karate, which has very little traditional lineage in Japan. Those are modern martial arts. They're martial arts that were basically created after the samurai era.
Hmm.
Martial arts prior to the 1880s are classical martial arts, and in these martial arts, they're more likely to be referred to as a jutsu instead of a do, and they're more likely to focus traditionally on like battlefield tactics and combat. And they're historical nowadays. The only reason you really train them is for historical purpose.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, just since we're on nomenclature right now. Uh, Before we'd be talking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they would be referring to what we would call Japanese Jiu-Jitsu as Jujutsu. Is that right?
That's correct. So ju is suppleness, softness, yielding, and jutsu is an art or a skill. And in English, it just kind of sounds like jitsu when you say it fast. So we just say jitsu with an I. But it's
So,
actually jutsu. Jutsu. All three syllables sound the same with their vowel.
okay, so it wasn't really the word that changed. It was just who was pronouncing it, and then they spelled it wrong.
That's right.
Hmm.
That's 100% right. So when you ever hear people, like the other day, I saw someone get upset about like, oh, so and so spelt jujitsu wrong, and it didn't matter which way they want to spell it because it was all wrong.
Mhm. Yeah,
It's like, well, what's your way of spelling it? Well, that's wrong too.
it's the same thing with us, right? OSS is actually a bad pronunciation of osu, which is OSU.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. That's actually only happened within the past 10, 20 years.
Really, is it that
That's
recently?
Well, how long have people been saying oaths? I don't think they've been saying it for very long because
That's a good question. I've
that
only been in this for just over a decade.
now that we're talking about it, let's go on a tangent about oaths for a
Sure.
second. Oaths is another product of modern martial arts from Japan. They probably didn't say it back in the day. It's not a samurai word. I train. I'm a black belt in Kyokushin karate,
Hmm.
and they say it a lot in Kyokushin karate.
Yeah,
And
I
they
heard it
also
in
say it.
karate too.
Yeah, they also say it in judo, I believe,
Hmm.
and I think they might even say it in kendo, like some of the modern martial arts, especially Kyokushin karate and judo. They say it a lot, and basically, it's a shortened version of a very long word I cannot remember, and it means patience, and it means strength. It has a lot of meanings,
Hmm.
but you know how you use it. The same way that we use it, the Japanese use it. It's like, yes, let's do this.
Yeah.
Let's fight.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, sir, kind of.
Yeah. It's
They
an
use it the exact
agreement
same way.
or,
An affirmation.
affirmation. Yeah.
And sometimes it's like a strength ki, right? But
Hmm.
in any case, yeah, that's a fairly modern invention. Like I don't even know if they did that prior to the 1950s. Somebody
Wow.
in Japan just started doing it, and they took the word and they just shortened it. It was like da 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 da, da, and they're just like this. They shortened it right down to just that one sound, and it's a long word. And anyway, so yeah, that's something it's spelt OSU technically,
Hmm.
but we've all just been spelling it OSS because that's what it sounds like, and well, that's kind of how you spell it now.
Yeah. Well, in Japanese, they kind of don't pronounce U's at the end of words, right?
That's correct, unless you're saying it properly, but nobody says it properly,
Yeah.
right? So, anyways, so where were we? 15th century Japan. This is
Yeah.
roughly the Sengoku era.
We're talking about Budo and trying to lead down the path to where we would get to unarmed combat and then specifically grappling.
All right, let's go. So Budo, it means martial arts, but the do part is different, and we'll talk about that in a minute here. It would have maybe been called Bujutsu. They might have called it Bujutsu because Bu is military or a warrior or something like that, and then Jutsu is art or skill.
Hmm.
Okay, so Jutsu would be something you'd learn when you're training martial arts, and there was many different jutsu. There was a jutsu for reading the stars. There was one for creating concoctions and potions and rations for survival. There was one for knowing the lay of the land. There was one for how to properly hold your breath when you're swimming. There was one for using a grappling hook. There was jutsu for how to interrogate someone without breaking someone without making them shell up. There was a jutsu for uh, impersonating the enemy when you're in disguise. There was literally one for everything, right? And so when we think of jutsus, we usually think of martial arts. And when we think of martial arts, we think of combat arts. But these were martial arts as in military arts all around. There was even arts for staring up over top of the enemy encampment. If you were kind of like a samurai warlock, you'd look over the enemy encampment and you'd be able to apparently read the aura based on the sky and what the cloud shapes would be and what star constellations were above their castle. And then based on the colors and the formations of those clouds, you could tell what the enemy lord was thinking and how the enemy would strike and how they would defend against certain attacks. Obviously, it's all very esoteric. It's all very witchcrafty. But this was that's something that you might have learned in a samurai school at one point
I
academically.
definitely need a black belt in that. Adding that to the bucket
Right?
list.
Yeah. So moving forward, the samurai went through the Edo period in the 17 and 1800s, where it was mostly a period of peace. Basically, a couple of major clans bound up and they just like took over and they unified Japan into a country. It wasn't just a bunch of warring states anymore. It was now like the country of Japan, right? And for the most part, it was a time of peace. But the aristocrats and the nobles were still samurai, even though they weren't fighting. So their martial arts kind of became more about like dueling. So they might meet in the street from time to time, or they might have tournaments or challenge matches, but they didn't have full scale wars anymore. And that's when maybe they started practicing the classical, how you'd imagine, like, okay, draw the sword, cut, put a sword away, sit back down, get up, draw the sword, cut, put the sword away, sit back down. And things became very formalized. So katas developed in a very formal patterns, and the martial arts they may have lost a bit of their substance from the Warring States period, but they developed into more of an art form that the samurai continued to practice. just like their poetry. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then the Meiji era came along, the Meiji Restoration, and this is in the late 1880s. What happened was, what's that?
This would be where you would draw the definition between classical and modern.
That's correct. So the Meiji Restoration, how it started was, okay, so imagine this. For centuries, Japan had closed off their doors from foreigners. They had basically give us all your guns. Now the doors are closed. And now for several hundred years, while the rest of the world was developing through the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, Japan was stuck in the medieval times, right?
Mm.
The technology wasn't advancing.
So it kind of backfired on them.
Exactly. And sure enough, along comes three very modern naval gunships from America. Big black ships. They roll up. They got big guns. They're basically godlike in capabilities compared to the Japanese.
Yeah.
And Commodore Perry, this American commander, comes out and he's like, "Y'all got to open your doors, or we're gonna blow your shit up." And I think it was maybe a year later. Don't quote me, but I think they're like, you got a year to do this. Make a decision, or we're gonna just storm your shit. And they came back a year later, and Japan, the main government, like the emperor, kind of was like, yeah, we better just give this up and modernize, because look, they're going to fuck our shit up. And we have a lot to learn from the rest of the world, especially the Western world. Because Japan saw itself as being superior to the other Asian countries, but inferior to America.
So this was a fairly different view for the emperor to take?
The samurai didn't like it.
I was going to say, was there resistance involved in that?
Yes, The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise.
Was that actually historically correct?
For the well, yes, a lot of it. Like the gist of that movie was correct. Tom Cruise's character wasn't a real person, obviously.
Of course.
But there were actually some white, like French samurai. There was a black samurai that worked for Nobunaga. The black samurai goes way back before this. It was a black samurai during the Sengoku era, during the Warring States period, who actually fought in wars. Yeah. So not all samurais were Japanese, but yeah. So the samurai didn't like it. So if you were a foreign, so there was huge rebellions. If you were a white person seen walking the streets in certain towns, they'd just chop you to pieces. But in other towns, if you were a samurai, they'd take hold of you and take your top knot off and send you back into the country. And they receded until finally there was nothing left of them. It was a briefly violent period in Japanese history where they tried to rebel, but it didn't last long, against all of the guns. Finally, the samurai were over. And in the retrospect, it was for the best, because Japan was able to quickly modernize and it started to become the country that it is today. It was a great country. At the time, the nobles could literally just kill people on the street. If you looked at them funny, they could, cut you down. They called it practicing their new sword, like sword testing, blade testing, right? And they could get away with that in certain contexts because they had the power. And what this did was the Americans coming in gave the power back to the emperor, gave it back to the government, and stripped the power from the samurai.
So this would have been a very welcome change if you were a civilian.
Absolutely. Yep. So now everybody starts wearing suits and ties and Western clothes, and they start taking photographs. Samurai didn't like that either. They had like the Native American thing going on where they thought the photographs were going to take your soul. Yeah, but so people, and then they put up power lines and railways, and Japan quickly changed. They were very ingenuitive people. Unfortunately, they didn't have the resources to do what they could have done so much quicker in such a short period of time. They ended up modernizing, right? So during the Meiji period, which is the 1880s, basically, the martial arts took a big back seat, because anything to do with the samurai was like that. Oh, those guys, those soldiers that were kicking our asses 20 years ago, we don't want to have anything to do with them. They were just like, the Gestapo. Yeah. The samurai were the Gestapo. They were the SS. They're the Nazis. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with them anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Including their martial arts, right? So martial arts like jiu-jitsu, and jiu-jitsu we haven't mentioned yet in this context, but jiu-jitsu was a theme of martial arts for hundreds of years. Jiu-jitsu was usually empty hand form of fighting usually in self-defense when you lost your weapons on the battlefield. It's probably how it originated. And sometimes jiu-jitsu would use with a dagger, like a tanto, like a short dagger, because that would be your backup weapon. And it was primarily a grappling style. Okay. The reason why jiu-jitsu was primarily a grappling style, or the hand-to-hand combat arts of samurai were grappling styles, were because they were wearing armor. And it's very difficult to strike someone with your bare fist or kick them when they're wearing armor and do any sort of damage unless you're hitting like an open spot.
That makes
Now,
sense.
there were strikes in jiu-jitsu back then. There were strikes. They were called atemiwaza. You know, you have tatewaza, standing, newaza, which is ground, and then you also have atemiwaza, which is striking techniques. The striking obviously probably wasn't as well founded as boxing or kickboxing or Muay Thai or anything like that, or karate, but it was there to kind of set up your grappling techniques and your takedowns, maybe as a stun, maybe just to a painful part of the body. But primarily, imagine that they're wearing full samurai armor. Your arm bar is just as effective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your uchimata, your hip throw, your double leg, it's all just as effective. Your chokehold is just as effective if you can reach underneath there and get a grip on their helmet strap or on their kimono underneath. Right. So that's why the samurai arts were primarily grappling arts, which is also good for the civilians when they started to learn, when they started being taught samurai arts, which were jiu-jitsu, because grappling is good for self-defense. So anyway, back to the Meiji Restoration era. It's kind of considered the art of thugs. Nobody wants to train jiu-jitsu anymore. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And along comes a boy named Jigoro Kano. This is a very important character. Most people should have heard of him if they practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because he's basically the founder of modern grappling, or at least the founder of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the founder of Judo, the founder, therefore, of all of the offshoots of Judo, like Jiu-Jitsu and Sambo, and had a very important effect on combat sports because of his mindset. So he was a boy. He was only 90 pounds and 5'2" when he was in high school, and he was getting beaten up by a bunch of local bullies. Ironically, he was a descendant of a samurai family, but because the samurai lost their power, his family was sake brewery. They're a pretty big sake brewing family. So yeah, otherwise, if it was a few decades earlier, he would have been a noble. One of the friends of the family, I think a friend of his father's, was one of the shogun's honor guards back in the day. And when he found out that Kano was suffering from bullying, he showed him some moves. He's like, this is jiu-jitsu. It's what the samurai did when they didn't have weapons. It's a very effective form of fighting. It was very brutal. And he showed him how to break arms, how to throw people on the ground, how to choke them out. And he was like, this isn't something that you should be learning today, but I'll show you some things just so you can defend yourself against these bullies. But Kano was amazed by like what he was capable of doing to a human body with his size, knowing jiu-jitsu, right? So we started looking into it. Although his father and even the ex-samurai were like, no, it's not a good idea, not during the Meiji Restoration. He looked into it. When he started university at Tokyo University, he started training, just want to make sure I got this right, Tenjin Shinto Ryu, or Tenjin Shinyo Ryu, which is the Divine True Willow School. He started training it under a man named Fukuda. And after Fukuda died, he went on to start training it under another certified instructor of the same school, and then that guy died. And then he went on to start training a style called Kito Ryu, which is two minds unified as one. That's what the translation is. I think it has something to do with you and your opponent being unified and then one overcoming the other.
Oh, I see.
Anyways, Kito Ryu was a style that heavily emphasized throwing techniques, tatewaza. I don't know what all jiu-jitsu styles emphasize, but this one emphasized throwing techniques, much like judo today emphasizes throwing techniques. But one thing that he had learned when he was training with Fukuda originally, the Shinyo Ryu, was live rolling, the concept of live rolling. He realized that some schools did it, some schools didn't. But the schools that practiced live rolling, which they call randori, were the more practical fighters when they were actually doing it. And the schools that he trained at, he saw to it that they were the ones that did the most randori, so he could get the most real practice. Some of the bigger, stronger, faster students were still kicking his butt. So he wanted even more knowledge. And in his thirst for knowledge, he started reading texts from around the world. He even read Western wrestling textbooks from the 1880s. And he introduced the fireman's carry to his own repertoire, which is in judo, the kataguruma, shoulder roll technique. And apparently the seoinage, which is the shoulder throw, the ippon seoinage, one of judo's most classic quintessential one-point throws. Both of those techniques he may have got directly from Western wrestling, reading it in the manual.
Mm-hmm.
And he used those techniques effectively just by reading these manuals and implementing it during their sparring practice. It's worth noting that Jigoro Kano was, in 1879, he did a jiu-jitsu demonstration. This is 2 years after he started training jiu-jitsu at Tokyo University. He did a demonstration for Ulysses S. Grant, the president of the United States at the time. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly. I don't really know that president. Ulysses, right. So Ulysses Grant went to Tokyo in 1879 and saw Jigoro Kano demonstrating jiu-jitsu. And he's not the first president that knew about jiu-jitsu before we did, because Teddy Roosevelt ended up learning a little bit as well. But we'll get into that. So anyway, Jigoro Kano, this is very important. Jigoro Kano starts developing his own style. He gets the Menkyo Kaiden, which is a certificate of knowledge, a certificate to teach, of instructorship from these other previous gyms. Okay, the two I just mentioned, the Shinyo Ryu and the Kito Ryu. And he's still learning jiu-jitsu from other sources, kind of eclectically mixing it together. He takes what he learns and he combines it and creates judo. At first, he called it Kano Jujutsu, just named it after himself, right? It's his style. And then later he called it judo. Judo is just changing the word jujutsu to judo. Do means a way. And whereas, as we said before, jujutsu is more like a skill or an art, do is like a way of life. It's a path that you follow throughout your life. And so he wanted to change this barbaric concept that martial arts was just for the ruffians to martial arts was once for the warriors, and now it can still be for the warriors of the modern day. And you can use the discipline and the spiritual teachings that the old warriors had and carry it through into the future. That was kind of the idea of changing to do. And Kenjutsu from the sword fighting styles became Kendo. Amongst other Japanese martial arts, they also changed to do, but his was the first, I believe, and it was also the most famous to be using that term do. Judo was the first of many things in martial arts, including using the gi, using the belt system, all that stuff.
You were saying that Kano, you were telling me earlier that Kano was the first one to really invent the gi, at which point he called the do-gi. Is that right?
That's correct. Prior to Kano, they were probably using a durable type of jacket, which looked probably like a gi top, and hakama pants, which is what samurai wore quite a bit. Those big parachute-looking pants.
Right, like a skirt-looking thing, eh?
That's right. Kind of look like a dress.
Some of the Japanese jiu-jitsu styles now still wear those.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Yeah, the traditional styles still do because they didn't have to adopt the modern training methods.
Right. What's the one that Seagal does? Aikido.
Aikido. They still do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Aikido, which comes from Aiki Jiu-Jitsu. Aiki Jiu-Jitsu changed to Do. Aikido. Anyways, and the reason he changed to pants, I'm assuming it's because everybody started wearing trousers. Prior to that, they were wearing like robes, like the kimono was kind of like a robe, or it was like the big puffy pants. People started wearing suit pants and stuff. So
again, it was just to keep with
keep
reality.
It modern. Exactly, right? People were wearing breasted suits, which is very similar to the gi. Prior to that, they were wearing robes, but the pants had to change. They had to become more like trousers. And the belt system, I think everybody was just wearing probably one color of belt. And then at some point, he realized that in order to like basically you would train a martial art back then in ancient Japan, and you would then become certified as an instructor. Not everybody was even certified as an instructor. He realized that modern people need a little bit of an extra oomph every once in a while to keep them going. So he started adding colors to the belts. Like he just made like a white belt and then yellow or whatever it was, getting darker through to black.
Mm-hmm.
He actually adopted that from a swimming system. The Japanese swimming teams were using ribbons around their, like not ribbons, but like a band around their waist. It started at white and ended at black to denote that they were like an advanced level swimmer.
Oh, interesting. I know that there was a, what would you call it, a wives' tale in old folklore, saying that the original belt styles, the karate style belt system, started with a white belt that just got so worn that eventually it became like blackish, and they were like, that's where they came from. It went from white to slightly off-white, like yellow, then orange, green, brown, black, as it just got worn in.
Bullshit. Yeah, no, it's total bullshit. It's funny because I've heard that so many times. That's literally what everybody thinks. The fact of the matter is, all you got to do is look back in history like 100 years. It's not that long ago. 100 years. We had automobiles at the time. There were some swimmers that were using belts from white to black, and judo directly adopted it. Jigoro Kano was like, that's a good idea. I'm just going to do that. It's not something that the samurai passed down onto us. So it's like, that's another one of the reasons why, like, when I get a new belt color, it's like, I'm happy as a personal accomplishment, but yo, this isn't some ancient lineage for me. You know, it's not something that goes way back. Nothing really is. Mm-hmm. Anyways, so where were we? So he's developing judo. A huge thing that he started to do with his students was remove the techniques that he deemed unsafe for live practice. What this meant was things like neck cranks, a lot of the reaping throws, some like really hard joint locks, like spiking someone on their head. A lot of the things that go back to the days of the samurai when, you know, combat was about killing someone. Nowadays, it was like, can't do that anymore. We're trying to make it into a sport, and he wanted everybody to practice it. So we started eliminating the things that were unsafe. And that way he was able to let his students train even harder because he knew that they weren't going to be punching, kicking, elbowing, or breaking each other's joints. Okay. And like I said, there were striking techniques in ancient jiu-jitsu, and there was in judo as well. To this day, there probably is in their curriculum deep somewhere a list of striking techniques that they're supposed to master. But he didn't allow them during the randori.
This is an interesting dichotomy that I'm seeing in my head starting here, is that as Jikano was trying to make it more safe so that people could practice it harder, the people were practicing the safer art harder and actually becoming better at the art than they would if they were using moves where they were constantly getting hurt.
Absolutely. And it's something that I believe that more martial artists need to understand in today's day and age. I think that just to jump to modern day, I think that the so-called self-defense systems, and we all know what they are, like Krav Maga and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not saying that they're useless systems, but what I'm saying is that if they don't practice any sparring, they're not going to be effective fighters at all. They need to drill things live. They need to practice live at full speed with full resistance, not a little bit of resistance, full resistance. Unfortunately, their biggest argument is that we can't go full resistance because that means elbowing someone in the cranium. That means breaking their knee, stomping their leg out. Like, that means gouging their eyes. And no, like, Jigoro Kano had all of those nasty techniques, and he just didn't allow his students to do any of them. And if there was ever a technique that came up that he's like, that's a little dangerous, okay, no more doing that, he would just like, he took statistics down. He's very specific. Oh, really? He took statistics of which techniques injured his students the most. And by the time the statistics reached certain levels, he would cut them off. And like you said, they were now able to train harder and were becoming better fighters because of it. And they were able to prove it. I'll just get to that in a moment. But like what I'm saying about modern day, if you train a martial arts style and you're not live practicing it, I'm sorry, you're not actually becoming a martial artist. If you're to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is a very effective martial art, and you never actually rolled, I'm sorry, but you're not becoming an effective fighter with it. You're just not. You cannot become an effective fighter. You're going to plateau right away. You're not going to be able to do street self-defense. So the so-called self-defense arts who claim to have more deadly techniques are not actually deadlier because they don't have the attributes that are required to fight. Now, Jigoro Kano's students were developing these attributes. They were developing strength. They were developing cardio. They were developing the repetitious techniques over and over and over again, and how to flow through these sequences with a resisting opponent. And they proved their skills in a major tournament in, I believe it's in the late 1880s. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department was looking for a style of jiu-jitsu that they'd be able to teach their police officers. And so they held a tournament with all these different schools competing against one another to figure out which was the best. And the Kodokan, which was the name of Jigoro Kano's school, the Kodokan Dojo won hands down for all of these jiu-jitsu contests. What the rules were, I'm not 100% sure. But they won primarily by throwing techniques, by getting hold of the opponent, throwing them onto the ground, and slamming them over and over and over again until they had won and cleaned house of this tournament. And they became like overnight sensation, greatest martial arts school in Japan. And Jigoro Kano's eyes were set even higher than that. He wanted the world to know what jiu-jitsu was, or what Kano jiu-jitsu or judo was.
Were there specific like top students that were being represented there? Was Kano himself doing it, or was it just his number one students as representatives?
I don't think Kano did it himself, because I think if he did, I'd probably have read about the specific match that he had, and I didn't see anything about that. But his students, which, by the way, I mean, not to take credit away from him, but these guys weren't fresh students. They were guys who had already been training at the various different schools, sometimes at schools that he'd gone to and been like meeting these other students and say, hey, want to come train at my gym a little bit? They'd come to Kodokan. They all trained together, and they're like, this is how I want to train from now on. And then they stuck with Kodokan, and he built his original base of students. Many of them were actually already what you'd call a black belt, even though they didn't have black belts. They were already black belts from other schools. They had been training for years.
So it was more people taking up his training style, not really
his training. His training methods, exactly. His training methods, and he did have specific techniques that he wanted to pass down onto them, but it was his training methods that was making them enhance their abilities so quickly. So, again, not to take anything away from him, but they were already seasoned grappling veterans by the time they started with Kodokan. But their method made them even better.
So you're saying he's looking at the world now. Like there is, I think we're getting closer to the point that we're seeing people extending their reach outside of Japan.
That's correct. He actually, I'm not sure at what point he had his sights set on Olympics, but it was very early. It was very early in the age of when the Olympics started coming around. He's like, that's what I want judo to be. I want it in the Olympics. I want everybody in the world to train judo. I want it in the school systems. And immediately Japan adopted it into their school systems. To this day, everybody in Japan trains judo to some extent, and almost every single Japanese high school has a judo club.
That's awesome.
So it was adopted in the school system almost instantaneously, at least in the early 1900s. But we're back in the late 1880s and the 1890s. So Kodokan is young, it's strong, it's coming up through the ranks. But there's one thing we have to mention that is oftentimes left out before we start talking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It is heavily the reason why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is what it is, I think. We said that Judo and Kodokan seemed undefeatable. In fact, there was another school that challenged Kodokan and defeated them. Oh. And that school was known as Fusen Ryu. They were an old style of jiu-jitsu dating back hundreds of years. And their head instructor, his name was Mataemon Tanabe. Tanabe was, for whatever reason, I have yet to discover, he was really good at Newaza. Really good at it. And I don't think the style of Fusen Ryu traditionally, like his father and his father's father, I don't think they all taught the way that he did by the sounds of it. Because again, they are descendants of a samurai school. They taught things like, I read up the list of the arts that they teach. They teach things like chain whip shit.
Yeah.
Like the Kusarigama, which is the kama attached to a chain. Like they were specialists in that kind of stuff. I don't know why he becomes this guy that's really good at triangle chokes and butt scooting. I'm not sure how it became that way. But there probably was an extensive list of Newaza techniques that he might have had that the Kodokan probably didn't. For whatever reason, Fusen Ryu and their head instructor, Matai Montanabe, challenged Kodokans as many schools did, and most of their fighters beat most of the Kodokan fighters. And they did so by doing things like pulling guard, by butt scooting, by dragging the fight to the ground. Even though they weren't as good at the takedown game, they dragged the fight to the ground and finished via submission. Submissions in Japanese or submissions in judo and jiu-jitsu are known as katamewaza, which is like locks, basically locks and chokes. They were, whereas the Kodokan was beating people via throws, the Fusen Ryu defeated the Kodokan via submission holds, primarily by taking them down and winning in the Newaza aspect of the fight, the ground fighting aspect of the fight. And they had a ground fighting revolution, much like we did in the 90s when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rolled around. Basically, Jigoro Kano and the Kodokan students were like, whoa, there's an entire aspect of our game that we're missing, and that's all these joint locks on the ground. So Jigoro Kano, instead of being an asshole about it, he hired Matai Montanabe from the Fusen Ryu school to teach at the Kodokan his blend of Fusen Ryu Jiu-Jitsu. And what he taught became known as a branch of the Kodokan known as
Kosen
Judo. That's correct. Yeah. And Kosen Judo it's not to be a different style. It's just like a branch of Kodokan. And it's still practiced in a sportive form today. It looks a lot like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Some universities still practice it today. Yeah. A lot of the original Kosen guys are gone. But some of the biggest ones, like Masahiko Kimura was a Kosen Ryu guy, or was a Kosen Judo guy. Mitsuo Maeda probably was as well. Mitsuo Maeda was a Kosen Ryu guy as well. So again, it's still judo. It's just these particular black belts focused on the ground fighting aspects that this dude had introduced. It's very important that we mention that, because a lot of people would go, why is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu so ground oriented and today's modern judo isn't? And I think a lot of it has to do with this. Now, prior to the World War II, judo started to look a lot like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu does today. Judo would have had a lot of ground fighting in it. Yeah, in the old days. If you were to walk into a judo club, they probably would have been rolling around on the ground quite a bit. So anyways, this is where judo is now. And it's the early 1900s. Jigoro Kano decides to start sending delegates around the world. I think Theodore Roosevelt brought some judo practitioners to demonstrate, maybe in New York or somewhere in the United States. Because I know that guys like Mitsuo Maeda, the famous Mitsuo Maeda, for example, did travel across the eastern seaboard of North America. He spent a lot of time in Cuba, and he ended up in Brazil. Now, these guys who were delegates to go around the world, I believe that they were allowed to participate in challenge matches, just as they did back in Japan. In Japan, there were tournaments. But you weren't allowed to prize fight for money. That was a big thing that Kano was against, like morally and ethically, I believe. Right? So because he wanted it to be a way of life and not a way of making money, even though those two are so closely tied together.
Well, it probably stops the thuggery, hey?
Exactly. So what he does, Mitsuo Maeda's traveling North America, and from time to time, he'd go to like a local circus and do a demonstration. But in these cases, he wasn't really spreading the word of jiu-jitsu. He was just challenging people and making money to do it. Now, I don't know if he called the style at the time judo or Kano jiu-jitsu. It was probably called judo. But because Jigoro Kano was against prize fighting, Mitsuo Maeda changed the name. He just called it jiu-jitsu. He didn't say anything special, just called it jiu-jitsu instead of calling it judo. He didn't want to call it Kodokan Judo because, God forbid, Jigoro Kano finds out about it back home and he's cut, right? He doesn't want to get cut. Yeah. So now he's fighting for money. He's prize fighting, and he's kicking a lot of ass, apparently. From time, like usually if somebody would come up and want to grapple with him, one of his requirements, because he's Japanese and a lot of these Americans were bigger than him, he would require for them to wear a judo gi. And it obviously made it much easier for him to be able to choke them or throw them. And that, I think, was his main only requirement. Otherwise, they would participated in what was called no holds barred. Not necessarily full MMA matches, probably, but more likely just no holds barred grappling matches, as in you're allowed to do any submission hold you like. He may have participated in some valet to do-esque fights, like real fights, because he may have started to implement a game based around closing the distance from an opponent's striking distance in the free fighting phase, closing that gap into the clinch, getting a takedown, and then implementing the judo to get a
Hoist
submission hold.
Gracie-esque UFC 1, hey?
Exactly. So Mitsuo Maeda may have already started kind of creating that mindset of Valley to Do within the jiu-jitsu world. But anyway, so he's fighting his way around North America, and he's not the only one that was doing it, by the way. Like, if you read anything about jiu-jitsu fighters of the era, Yukio Otani had a huge contribution to martial arts in Great Britain. Yukio Otani was a man who went to Britain and opened a jiu-jitsu or a judo school there. And have you ever heard of the martial art Bartitsu?
Never heard of it.
Okay, well, Sir Barton Wright was a man who had kind of traveled the world and learned all these different martial arts styles. And he went back to the UK around the turn of the century there and opened up his own style in London. It was a combination of boxing, savate, so they had kicking, cane fighting, sword fighting, grappling from wrestling, catch wrestling, and jiu-jitsu.
So this is exactly what you would see in Sherlock Holmes.
Actually, it's mentioned in Sherlock Holmes. Yes, in fact, Sherlock Holmes is, I can't quote it, but it's something along the lines of first in the Japanese art of wrestling.
Yeah, and I believe they talk about his skill with a cane as well.
Yeah, so there was a very gentlemanly martial art in London at the time to be able to fight with your cane or your umbrella or whatever, or a cane sword. So Bartitsu was a style of gentleman's martial art for self-defense in London, and it was based also off of judo or jiu-jitsu, however you want to call it, from one of the delegates of the Kodokan named Yukio Otani, who was also a traveling prize fighter. Okay. Or if not a prize fighter, a traveling fighter.
So this is contemporary to Maeda, you were saying?
Yeah, exactly. The exact same time. Tani was over there. Maeda was in New York. Maeda traveled down into Cuba, around South America, and ended up in Brazil. And Maeda wasn't the first Japanese martial artist in Brazil. There was some other ones. Like, for example, it's either Gio Omori or Geo Omori, however it's properly spelt. Omori opened the first jiu-jitsu school in Brazil in 1909. He also would have been a Kodokan black belt who got there before Maeda did. And he taught the likes of Luis Franca, you know, the leader of GF team, and a lot of Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belts and champions, world champions, are under the Luis Franca lineage. A lot of people don't realize this, but there's no Gracie name whatsoever in that lineage going all the way back.
This is super fascinating. This is something that I learned not that long ago. Because like you're saying, it's not very well expressed throughout Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a whole. Because when you hear about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and you go Google it, the first thing you're going to come across is the founders, Elio and Carlos.
That's right. That's right. Now, they may be the founders of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, to be more specific, but not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
So they were like basically the same style was being taught via Japan to different Brazilian families, and they basically took it up upon themselves to distribute it to other people, creating their own Brazilian lineage.
That's right, separately. And there wasn't just those two. There was other ones as well. They just didn't become famous. Luis Franca definitely did, and the Gracies definitely did. Those are probably the two most famous ones.
Yeah,
right?
Like for instance, for anybody listening who doesn't know who Luis Franca is by name, like you were saying, GF Team is directly descended from them as far as their affiliation is concerned. And we're talking about world champions like Rodolfo Vieira, Our Canadian champion, our most medaled Canadian black belt is Jake McKenzie, who's GF team. Literally,
Talita Allen Carr.
yeah, that's right. Literally no Gracie lineage at all. So if you pride yourself as being like jujitsu is from Elio or is from Carlos, and
If
there's
you're wearing
nothing
an
else.
Elio Gracie T-shirt, you kind of screwed up.
Well, I'm just saying, like there's actually legitimate Brazilian jiu-jitsu that has nothing to do with that.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm not taking anything away from the Gracies. I'm definitely not taking anything away from Elio or Carlos. But you have to know this. This is why I was saying at the beginning of the podcast. It's very important that you know the history of what you're doing, because you could say some stupid shit and you wouldn't even realize it. You know, you got to know your stuff. I think it's good to pay homage to all of the masters of the past, but especially the ones of your lineage. They're the ones who passed down to you. Now, ironically, most people in the jiu-jitsu community have no idea how much of an effect Luis Franca's lineage has.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, again, he started training before Mitsuo Maeda even got to Brazil, as far as I know.
Okay, so take us back now. We're early 1900s. This is when Maeda would be teaching in Brazil. Like, if I remember correctly, it's somewhere between 1910, 1920, I think, is when the Gracies started being taught as kids.
Yeah. So again, I said the first jiu-jitsu school is in 1909 in Brazil with Geo Omori. Some of the other mentionable black belts of the Kodokan that were in Brazil at the time also teaching were Soshiro Satake and Takeo Yano. Takeo Yano, Soshiro Satake, and Geo Omori were three other predominant black belts teaching in the area at the time. Luis Franca learned from all three of those guys, but primarily Omori.
And they would all be teaching essentially the same style of that.
They're all teaching Kodokan Judo curriculum that they had learned from Jigoro Kano.
Including the Kosen branch?
Including the Kosen branch, that's correct. So the Kosen was added to Judo before that.
Mm.
But at the time, they were really into Kosen Judo. They really emphasized the ground fighting element of it because it had recently been adopted. So guys like Mitsuo Maeda, I don't know about the other ones, but Mitsuo Maeda for sure was a Kosen Judo guy.
Okay, so this is what you would recognize more as what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is conceptually, is working off of your back against a larger, stronger opponent.
Yeah, at least working on the ground, you know. So Maeda, at the time, I don't know if he actually had any intentions on teaching jiu-jitsu. He decided, I think he wanted to kind of like hang out in Brazil for a while, didn't want to go back to Japan. The dude was a gangster. I mean, he had already like beaten a bunch of guys up and traveled the world and made a pretty big name for himself. But he got into business, and it might have been real estate. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he met Gustavo Gracie, who is Elio and Carlos' father. And Gustavo, they helped one another through some business deals, and as payback for Gustavo helping him, he promised to teach his kids. So he started teaching some of the Gracie brothers, some of the original Gracie brothers, Gustavo's kids. Two of them, amongst those kids, two of them were Carlos Gracie Sr. and Elio Gracie. Again, you could be from an Elio Gracie lineage and not understand that Carlos Gracie lineage, or you could be from a Carlos Gracie lineage and not know the Elio Gracie lineage, because they're actually separate lineages, and they're basically separate Gracie families since they split basically. But they were the two Gracies that majorly carried Mitsuo Maeda's jiu-jitsu, and ultimately Elio's son, Horian, brought it to the United States with the UFC.
Yeah, definitely, I think, besides the actual art itself, which obviously everybody who's learned that style from that lineage owes the art to them, I think the Gracies could be lauded for the marketing that they did. Like, they made it famous, and that's very important to spreading something, especially globally or at least internationally.
That's absolutely right. So anyway, let's skip ahead a little while. The Gracies have been learning jujitsu from Maeda. Now, this is a very gray area. I don't know how much time they spent learning from Maeda. I don't know if they learned also from these other guys, these other black belts that I had mentioned, these from Japan. Maybe it was like some open mat things were going on where sometimes Miso Maeda would have them come over because they all knew each other.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe they just stayed disconnected. Maybe I don't know if the Gracies cross-trained with Louis Franca or what happened. I mean, it's probably something that they didn't really want to talk about, and if they did, you'd have to read like newspaper clippings from the 1920s, 1930s to even know.
Mm.
But yeah, the Gracies, they I don't know what they trained, how they trained, when they trained, where they trained. That's very dark. It's like a dark pocket of information that I can't even talk about because, frankly, some of the guys, their grandkids are still alive. They probably know better than I do. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we do know that they participated in Valet Tudo, which was again an extension of that concept of the traveling circus, which happened around Brazil, where they would do no holds barred fights. Although these fights were actually no holds barred, they were what Americans would call rough and tumble, which meant that like anything goes, and that was Valet Tudo, the free form style of fighting. And that's probably where jiu-jitsu continued to develop more of a street fighting edge, more so than what Jigoro Kano had done with the judo, where he was implementing more rules, or taking away the deadly techniques, implementing more rules. What he did was he set up the training methodology to become harder and more rugged. But then when it went to Brazil with Maeda and the Gracies and the other Brazilians, they probably started emphasizing going back to like combat efficacy in Vale Tudo style matches. We don't know. I don't know a lot about their matches in Vale Tudo, but I do know that, like in the 1950s, for example, Elio decided that he would have a match against the best jiu-jitsu fighters in the world, who were from Japan. They were judo fighters, right? And the best of the time was Masahiko Kimura. But Kimura was like, I'm not going to have a match against some guy in Brazil. They're not famous judo people. He's like, if he wants to send one of other guys over there to have a match against him. So they did send another guy, a couple of Japanese black belts over, and Elio beat them. I think he choked. I think the one guy, at least, he choked unconscious with a cross collar choke. And by the way, according to mythology, Elio was like a weak and frail man. I don't think that was the case. I think he was pretty athletic. Apparently, he was a swimmer or something like that, like on the swimming team. Swimming comes up a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, isn't that strange?
Anyways, so yeah, and then as far as him, like adding, one of the big things the Gracies say that Elio did was add like leverage to jiu-jitsu, and that's, I don't know, it's just a silly thing to say because if you look at judo, every single throw relies on maximal leverage, right? If you look at any of the classical moves from even like Aikido, that's all about leverage, whether or not it's practical. You even look at something like boxing or Muay Thai, the way that you land a strike and place your momentum and your kinetic energy through your body and the biomechanics, it's all heavily based on leverage. Like, they make it sound like he added leverage to jiu-jitsu. Like, and I've literally heard Gracies in interviews say that he added leverage to the techniques. He definitely didn't just pop leverage out of thin air. But he may have put leverage in certain places in his own style of jiu-jitsu. Like, everybody who does jiu-jitsu, every generation is going to change something. And maybe in his own mind, one of the things that he thought he changed the most was their use of leverage. That might be the case. You know?
Well, I think it's probably just a poetic way of saying that Elio was likely one of the smaller guys that he would be training with. So as a smaller guy, he has to hit the leverage part of every technique perfectly.
That's right.
So he may have personally been very skilled at the details involved in leverage, because otherwise they wouldn't work for him.
Exactly. And well, it's just funny. I mean, they make it sound like the old style jiu-jitsu or judo was based on like strength and technique, whereas like and less of leverage and cunning.
Yeah, there might be a little bit of
definitely the
wordplay
case.
involved in there that isn't quite as literal.
Well, for one thing, like the average Brazilian is a lot larger than the average Japanese,
For
just
sure.
for example.
For
So
sure.
it's not like they're all of a sudden like able to use strength out of nowhere. It does so happen that Masahiko Kimura was a lot bigger than Elio, outlaid him quite a bit. But anyway, after Elio choked out one of the other delegates from the Kodokan, and by the way, this is post World War II Kodokan, and it's now an Olympic sport, and they've started to chop away a lot of the things that were really effective in the ground fighting element, because they wanted judo in Japan was supposed to become more aesthetically pleasing for the audience if it were to become a legitimate Olympic sport, right? So they chopped out a lot of the newaza, or at least they timed it. They had major time limits. They chopped out a lot of the really cool deadly submissions or deadly techniques. So judo had changed, and judo is now a lot different from jiu-jitsu. But guys like Masahiko Kimura, who had been around for a few decades, were still good at the old school versions of judo, which was like submission grappling style judo, right? So anyway, Kimura is like, okay, well, I guess this Gracie guy is pretty legit. He beat a couple guys that I had a lot of respect for. So he heads over to Brazil, and he goes into this stadium where they're going to hold the match. And apparently, the Gracies had a coffin set up for him, and he asks the staff, like, what's the coffin all about, right? And they're like, oh, Elio said that's for you. And he's like, okay.
That's so WWE.
Yeah, he's just thinking like, wow, this is gimmicky, right? And it's worth noting that guys like Masahiko Kimura, they actually participated in professional wrestling. So they're in that world. That even back in the 1950s, pro wrestling was like really big in Japan, right? So a lot of these guys were actually pro wrestlers. But anyway, so yeah, actually, let me think here. Did Masahiko Kimura die that way?
In pro wrestling?
Yeah, did he get shot in pro wrestling? Let me look this up.
Wait a second. You're allowed to have guns in pro wrestling? I want to watch the Japanese pro wrestling. That sounds much more interesting.
There was a famous Japanese pro wrestler that he didn't throw the fight. He was supposed to throw a fight, and he ended up beating up his opponent, and he got shot like a week later.
Oh, I remember hearing that. I don't think that was him. That was somebody else.
Who was it?
I can't remember, but I believe that you can watch the match.
I know that Masoyama was involved. Masoyama is the founder of Kyokushin Karate, and him and Masahiko Kimura were buddies.
Maybe this has happened to more than one person then, because the one I'm thinking of is like much more modern.
It may have, yeah. I just want to see how he died. Oh, he died of lung cancer when he was 75. Never mind.
that's an interesting bullet.
Yeah, and he died on April 1993, shortly before they aired the UFC. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
So anyway,
I never knew that.
Yeah. So thanks for Wikipedia. So anyway, they have a match, and it's a long match. I think it's 90 minutes or something like that, maybe 45 minutes at least. And Kimura was throwing Gracie around like a rag doll. But then when it went to the ground, Kimura would hit like a chokehold, and apparently Elio went to sleep, but his eyes were still open, and he woke back up when he released the chokehold, and he kept going, and it ended up getting caught. Kimura caught Gracie in a Kimura lock. This is a famous match, so like if you're a true blue Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu historian, you have to at least know about this. And he broke his arm in several places, and then the Gracies had to throw in the towel. But yeah, it was kind of like, I think even in the newspapers, they said like victory to Gracie in the headlines. And it was kind of propaganda, but it was mostly based on the fact that he had survived the match with Kimura when nobody thought that he would. And he didn't, I don't know if he tapped out. I think they threw in the towel for that one. There was a lot of Gracies throwing in towels in the past 100
so it was
years.
a big old moral victory.
Yeah, it was a moral victory for him for sure. The Gracies, they might have, how do you say, spun the tale from their own perspective in their favor, but they never disrespected Kimura or said that that they should have won or anything like that. It was pretty obvious, but it was a big moral victory for them. And of course, they adopted the name of the technique for ude guruma, which is the reverse arm lock, as opposed to the Americana. They named it the Kimura. And then when you jump ahead, and jiu-jitsu continued to expand from there, but ultimately stayed within Brazil. Like, they weren't good at marketing outside of Brazil. And the rest of the world after the 1950s, the Western world didn't know much about martial arts outside of judo. Even Masahiko Kimura referred to the Gracies as judo black belts.
Mm.
And by the way, I should say this. I don't know how true this is, but I had heard in an interview that judo delegates were sent from Japan to Brazil to offer black belts to the Gracies if only they called their style judo and not Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And they declined it. So anyway, they weren't marketing themselves very well. And then we move into, I guess, like, I think Horian moved to LA, into Hollywood, and just started like low-ranking Hollywood stuff, working on movie sets and on backgrounds, and was the fight coordinator for was it not Lethal Weapon? What was that one with Mel Gibson in it where he does a triangle choke?
No, it is Lethal Weapon.
Lethal Weapon?
Yep.
Lethal Weapon 1, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so he does a triangle choke in that one. Legit triangle choke before UFC 1.
Mm-hmm.
And that was coordinated by Horian Gracie, who is, if you don't know, Elio Gracie's son, for those who don't know. And he's kind of like the mastermind behind the UFC and the guy who was a mastermind behind marketing. And he brought jiu-jitsu into LA, or into California, I should say, by teaching out of his garage. It was very small in the 80s. And he was also teaching the very famous Chuck Norris.
Mm-hmm.
Chuck Norris was taught some Brazilian jiu-jitsu for some of the movies that he was doing. And Chuck Norris is a legit martial artist, okay? All jokes aside, the dude's legit. Like, he's a legitimate karate champion. He knows how to fight. And he saw something in Gracie's jiu-jitsu. And there's actually an entire YouTube video you can watch from the late 80s where he introduces Horian and a bunch of the brothers and has like a gymnasium of his karate students learning Brazilian jiu-jitsu from the Gracies, because he knew how effective it was before it even hit the UFC. So then Horian, he's like, okay, he has these challenge matches, the Gracie challenge, right? And they're super effective, but again, they're not, aside from having these VHS tapes, they're not breaking into the mainstream. You could be a mainstream martial artist or be really into martial arts in the 80s and early 90s and not have any idea what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was.
Mm-hmm.
So finally he devised UFC.
Back then, as far as Americans knew about martial arts, it was all what they saw on the movie screen, right? It's like a lot of Bruce Lee shit, Jeet Kune Do, and stuff that was popular on the big screen. Jiu-Jitsu wasn't on it.
That's correct. I mean, when you thought of, Danaher made a big point about this, like back in the day, like in the 70s and 80s, when you thought of martial arts, you thought of people doing high kicks and shit. You didn't even think of boxing when you thought of martial arts. Nowadays, boxing is like on the top of my list of like top 10 favorite martial arts, but you don't even think of boxing as a martial art back then. You only think of things like taekwondo, karate, ninjutsu, judo, right? Like, you didn't think of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and you certainly didn't think of grappling as martial arts. So the first images that come to mind are things from the movies, like you said, Bruce Lee movies and the Karate Kid and Kung Fu. The truth is, around the world, like the real truth is, most martial arts are some kind of grappling arts, because almost every society or every like ethnic region had some form of folk wrestling. Almost every single one did. So yeah, I think it's more natural for people to wrestle than to do high kicks, for sure. In any case, yeah, no one was thinking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
So Horian is the one that comes up with the UFC then, which at that point was the ultimate fighting challenge.
Yeah. And I guess the only place that they could hold it was in Denver. And they had a whole bunch of ideas for the whole like octagon thing. Like, I think they were going to do like a moat. Sometimes they thought about like electric fence.
I remember
they're all crazy,
hearing like a moat with alligators in it and stuff. They wanted to go like full ridiculous level Hollywood.
Yeah. But it's a good thing they didn't, because they just crossed the line. They crossed the line when they had the UFC, but they just crossed it a little bit, I think. For some people, it was way beyond the line. But for like a combat sports enthusiast, if you were into kickboxing or boxing, you're like, that's kind of crazy, but it's a sport. They're still in a cage. There may not be any rules, but at least there's a cage. A pit of freaking alligators? It's not a sport anymore.
Yeah, we can deal with human cockfighting, but human cockfighting and alligators? Now you've gone too far, mister.
Yeah, exactly. Just give me 1 sec here. I'm just going to crack a beer.
Okay. Trying to remember when exactly UFC 1 happened. I want to say it's 94, but for some reason I'm thinking 93. And I think that it was held in Colorado for the very reason that it would have been illegal in California to do. So, do you know anything about this, Logan? Like, it was in 93 or 94 that UFC 1 happened?
Late 93.
Okay, so I think it was October 93 then. And it was being held in Denver, correct me if I'm wrong, just because it was illegal to be held in California. They had to find somewhere that would allow them to sanction it, or at least that wouldn't disturb them, wouldn't ask them to sanction it.
Yeah, exactly. And as the story goes, I mean, like, honestly, I'm pretty sure Orion made the UFC 1 for them to win. He didn't pick the best fighters in the world.
Well, trying to remember who all was in UFC 1. Can you remember? There was obviously there was
there was Gerard Gordeau.
Okay.
He's kind of legit. Kyokushin guy. He's kind of legit. He was the guy that was the first match, and he went against that big black sumo dude. And
kicked his tooth out.
And they had Superfoot Wallace, Bill Wallace, come out to do the commentating because Chuck Norris was like, "Fuck that shit." So they had Superfoot Wallace, who was a kickboxing champion, kind of in line with Chuck Norris as well at the time.
Didn't they have some dragon guy? Isn't that right?
They had a few interesting characters. What was his name? Who was that one black guy who wore the funky hat, who was in UFC 1 commentating?
I'd have to rewatch.
What was he doing?
Man. It's been too long.
Anyways, so yeah, there was there was the boxer with the one glove boxer.
How Street Fighter is that?
So gimmicky, it's so gimmicky. And then there was there was Ken Shamrock, and that guy's legit. He was legit shoot fighter. So and it stood to reason that they would get Ken Shamrock. So I mean, the origins of MMA didn't start with the UFC. It's kind of that's like the mainstream explosion kind of in the United States, but Japan has done Shuto since 1986, I think. And Pancrase. They'd been doing that before that as well. The idea was like MMA in Japan was like they really like pro wrestling, as we previously mentioned, but they also like real fighting, and pro wrestling's not real. Sorry, guys. And a lot of pro wrestlers had a real wrestling background, and they thought, you know what, let's do pro wrestling but for real. And they called it a shoot when it was a real match. That was an English term. It was a shoot when it was a real match, right? And shoot fighting, or shuto, was the name they gave this like new martial arts concept, where it was like a professional wrestling match, but it was a real fight. And that's where we get Pancrase, which is basically like pro wrestling but real. And that's where you get shuto and shoot fighting, and that's where you get guys like Ken Shamrock. Yeah,
Bas Rutten.
Yep, exactly. So Ken Shamrock was a good choice for UFC 1, I think, because he was a good fighter. But honestly, Horian knew what he was up against. He knew to put Royce Gracie, because Royce was only like 28 years old and 170 pounds, something like that. Wasn't the most physically foreboding, menacing-looking guy in the tournament by any means. Probably the least scary one. But he beat them all using purely Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
In the gi.
And in the gi, yeah. But only because the other guys didn't really know how to use the gi against him.
Yeah, for sure.
He went against Sakuraba, and Sakuraba used that gi against him, But anyway, that was the UFC 1. It was a very interesting turn, and I had heard that like Hickson wasn't fighting in the United States because the reason Hickson fought over in Japan, a lot of the times you hear it's because like he wanted to go back to like the roots of jiu-jitsu, but the truth was he was fighting over there because he wasn't allowed to fight in the States, as far as
Yeah,
I know.
we actually covered this on an earlier podcast with Eli Knight, who is from the Hoist Gracie lineage. He's one of the early American black belts under him.
Okay.
And he said that, I mean, Horian was a very savvy businessman, always has
Mm,
been.
mm.
And he was the one that brought Hickson up from Brazil and brought him, helped him get into America and set him up in California.
He couldn't even speak English very well at the
No,
time, right? Or
no,
Horian
and
was already there for a long time.
that's right. And Horian had the lawyers, and he drafted up a contract for Hickson to sign when he came over to teach for him.
Mm.
And part of that contract, in the print that this poor guy coming up from Brazil could hardly read, was that he was not allowed to do prize fighting. Like he wasn't allowed to fight for money. And
Right,
so that precluded him from going into Horian's own tournament.
right. That's smart.
I mean, there's some other things I've heard that I'm pretty sure are correct. That he still holds either patent rights or copyrights over the words Gracie Jiu Jitsu as well as the triangle as it's involved with it, so he can sue people for using it,
That's right.
which
Yeah.
stopped some of his other family members from doing the same thing. He basically took a monopoly over their style in America before anybody else could get up there to do it.
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying. Like the Gracie family is divided. It's not one family right now. It's a division, right? So it depends on what lineage you study under. But like as far as I saw, there's two major lineages: the Carlos lineage, which focused more on like the IBJJF concepts, and then there's the Alio lineage, which kind of went more of the MMA route. But there's not a lot of them left except for like Cron Gracie. But yeah, like those brothers, Hoist, Hickson, they were more of the MMA guys, and then more of what they would call the traditional guys, the self-defense oriented guys, right?
Yeah, so now we're into early 90s, and this is when the explosion really happens of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in America. Like suddenly the word is out. You've got VHSs being jammed into blockbusters all over the place of UFC 1 through 3 of this guy, this 170-pound guy who's choking people and breaking their arms.
Yeah. And I remember I actually watched it when I was a kid back in the day because I learned martial arts from my dad. That's what really got me into martial arts. I didn't choose the thug life. Thug life chose me. And I was watching, I was sat down in front of a couch or like in a camper somewhere in the woods watching UFC 1, 2, 3 all the way up to the early teens as a kid on with my dad. And I remember that very vividly. And I remember being like, I thought the Hoist Gracie was basically like Superman,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And Ken Shamrock too. I thought he was super cool too when I was a kid. We just had these heroes, right?
Yeah, he had legend status for sure at that point. And it held out for decades after that. Like there was a point when he came back to fight in the UFC, I think in the like UFC 50 something or 60 something against Matt Hughes. And he was coming back as like, I've been away, but this is still my house kind of thing. And people bought it. Like I remember watching that one live and thinking like, man, they're really building this up, but maybe he is gonna beat Matt Hughes. Maybe he can do that. He's Hoist Gracie, like he's got this
he's like your original
super
champion
status.
right?
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah, no one could beat Hoist Gracie. And he had that one fight against Chemo, I think the dude's name was, the Hawaiian dude,
yeah.
who would come out on a cross like really theatrically, and that guy beat him up pretty badly, and he couldn't really continue.
Yeah.
Some crazy tournaments back then. And also, speaking of like superstar status, Ken Shamrock was really big in Japan. Apparently, he had a cereal brand, and his face was on a cereal box. And I'm thinking like that Mr. The Simpsons episode where Homer becomes like a candy or something like that. He's Mr. Clean or Mr. Shine or something like that.
Yeah,
I kind of imagine it that way.
I think he had his own. He was drawn into animes as well.
Ken?
Yes. Yeah, not Homer.
Well, a lot like I like anime, or I like reading manga. Like I like the comic book, Japanese manga. and I read a lot of manga that are based on kind of like reality MMA, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and
Hmm.
so many of the characters are obviously real life people,
Hmm.
just twisted versions of them, but they just draw them exactly like they are, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, I know who you're supposed to be representing here. There's no shame in it.
Yeah, I guess Ken's got his face in a few of those. I
Yeah,
think
for sure.
I think there's a part of this story that we may have skipped or at least hadn't touched on when we're sort of in between where Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu comes from Brazil up to America. Is there was a very notable person in the Gracie family who I don't think gets his due as often as he should, and that's Holds Gracie.
Absolutely.
So, do you
Yeah,
want to touch on him for a second?
the Gracie family talk very highly of him. Um, Oftentimes, if someone asked you who is the greatest Gracie of all time, if you ask me, I'd probably say Hickson.
Hmm.
I think Hickson's the greatest, but I don't know Holes. And according to Hickson and pretty much every other Gracie that knew him, Holes was the best. Holes apparently taught Hickson, or it was Hickson's, like, he was that one step above Hickson, who was like, they were
Yeah,
training partners, but he would ragdoll Hickson, and he kind of brought Hickson up underneath him.
yeah, I've heard that too. And there is a couple old, like, grainy footages of some randori between the two of them, which is interesting to see.
Outdoors too,
Yeah,
they
and
had like like
this is
Muay Thai style.
this is like what, back in the 70s at this point?
Yeah, the '70s and the '80s.
I only know that because of Holz's hair.
Yeah, no doubt, right? And
But
he's the whitest looking Gracie too.
he he was, I think, one of, if not the most dedicated Gracie of that particular generation to exploring and bringing in other styles or pieces of other styles into their curriculum.
Yeah, well, Holes was a American Sambo champion. Yeah, he had a lot of friends in the world of wrestling and in Sambo, and he entered a Sambo championship, I guess back in the '80s in the States, and won, and was also really into wrestling. Like, he had American friends that were into wrestling, which makes me question. Like I was saying to you before, I question about like things like the Americana. Like, why do we call it the Americana? I once asked a Brazilian black belt that one time. What does Americana mean? He said exactly what I expected. He said it means American woman. And I was like, okay. Well, to me, if you in English, Americana is something that is American-esque. It is American
Hmm.
stuff, right? So what if Americana was? I mean, we know that judo and jiu-jitsu has this lock, but maybe they named it just like they named the Kimura after Kimura. It's
Hmm.
probably wasn't something new to them. They just named it after him. Maybe they named the Americana after like an American wrestler who he was buddies with. Because I know that he had some American wrestling friends that he was very close with.
Hmm. I mean,
Or
there's
it could have been adopted before that, because I know that like Mitsuo Maeda, even himself, Mitsuo Maeda was an avid catch wrestler. Even though he was a judo black belt, when he was traveling across the states, you can't help but get involved in catch wrestling when you're doing these traveling
circus
circus
fights. Yeah.
events. Yeah. So he was definitely incorporating catch wrestling techniques. And I believe that Holes or Rolls, however you pronounce it, I think he was the same.
Hmm. Yeah. So, unfortunate for the world, really, but the story of Holz Gracie, he ended up dying in a hang gliding accident in Brazil.
Yeah, apparently he was an adrenaline junkie. He couldn't get enough of that excitement, right?
Yeah, it's just
So he
such an
moved into paragliding.
unfortunate and ignoble end to who was likely the greatest practitioner of his era.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the way they talk of him is really the only thing I have, right?
Hmm.
And they make it sound like he was that much better than Hickson. And Hickson's a big deal to me, you know.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. I should mention though, we did talk about Sambo for a moment there.
Right. Yeah, we kind of missed that on our retrospect into the history books. This is an interesting little a side note that I asked you about, and you said that you had recently been looking into, because
Hmm.
I really don't know much about Sambo outside of like Fedor Emelianenko is Sambo, you know. So as far as like the MMA uh, ties to it, you know, I know Fedor is supposed to be the best at Sambo, at least for his time.
Well,
Um,
Sambo is a super effective martial art. I mean, Fedor is one of many MMA champions who are Samboists, you know?
mhm. So yeah, go
Um,
into what you know about how that came about historically.
well, okay, so Sambo, we talked about these Japanese delegates from the Kodokan in the early 1900s going around the world teaching. We talked about, I mentioned Yukio Tani in the Britain and the UK. Um, I mentioned Mitsuo Maeda and all those guys that were in Brazil. There was also some foreigners who came to the Kodokan and trained at the Kodokan. Some of those foreigners were Russian, just a few of them. Okay. One guy, his name, um, this one guy's name was Vasily Oshepkov. I'm not good at Russian, so sorry if I butchered that, but Vasily Oshepkov. And he had trained at the Kodokan and received his black belt, maybe even second degree black belt. I can't remember.
Hmm.
And went back to Russia. And he started to form Sambo in the early 19 teens.
And Sambo is kind of like a sort of a half acronym, right? Like the way that Crow Cop means Croatian cop when we're talking about
Yes.
Mirko, Crow Cop.
Yeah, Sambo is an acronym for this. It's Samoshta Bez Orusia. Sam from Sambo
Mhm.
is Samoshta, B is Bez, O is Orusia. And what it means is a form of self-defense without the use of weapons.
Straightforward.
Very similar to jiu-jitsu.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, he started to develop Sambo by combining, obviously, mostly judo, because that's what he was good at. He was a secondary black belt in judo, with other things like catch wrestling, freestyle wrestling, Greco-Roman, and striking arts like boxing, yada, 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 to create a complete martial art for the Russian military to practice. And by the 1920s, it was considered one of the mainstream martial arts in Russia and one of Russia's national sports.
So this is during or directly after World War One?
This is directly after World War One. It was considered uh, a major training regimen for the Japanese. Sorry, not the Japanese, for the Russian. For the Russian military.
Hmm.
And then the 30s roll around, the late 30s, and Japan starts invading various parts of Russia on the Eastern Front. And Russia immediately goes balls to the wall, putting Japanese citizens into containment. Well, probably actually just killing Japanese citizens and putting anybody who is coercing with the Japanese into the containment camps, the gulags, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this Vasil Oshepkov, one of the founders of Sambo, I shouldn't say that he's the only one of a few. He gets sent to a gulag in the late 30s and is immediately he's immediately shot in the head. They executed him for being suspect for being a Japanese spy because he was a
judo.
black belt in judo and he had spent so much time in Japan.
Whoops.
Yep. Now this dude invented Sambo basically. He's the founder of Sambo. The military and the government loved this motherfucker up until they shot him in the head. And then after World War II, they still loved him because he was the founder of Sambo, but they still shot him in the head. And
that's just how Russia do.
Exactly. And so you have decades go by, the Russian Cold War, where they disavow any knowledge that Sambo had anything to do with Japan. And it's a Russian thing, it's just purely Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, USSR disbands and you have yourself people admitting the actual history of it, which I've been reading about, it's not hard to find, but it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool that he was shot in the head just for being a judo black belt, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also cool. It reinforces what I was saying earlier about how judo was such a revolutionary martial art for its time. People from around the world were affected by it. Great Britain, United States, Portugal.
Yeah.
There was presidents that were like presidents of the United States that were like, holy, there's something about this. You guys got to check this stuff out. And it really wasn't until the UFC 1993 where the Brazilians were like, yeah, you should really check this stuff out.
That's
And
so
by that
wild.
time, it had gone so far, you know?
Yeah, like you can basically see from Jigoro Kano its fingerprints on most, if not all, of the major first world countries of modern day Earth.
That's right. And that's not to say that, if you look at judo and jiu-jitsu, like Brazilian jiu-jitsu now, and you compare the two, they're very different,
Mm-hmm.
but mostly just because the rules are different.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Stefan Kesting from grapplearts.com who was saying that it's not like the martial art is composed of techniques. But we all assume that the techniques are the reason the martial art's the way it is. No, the techniques are just the techniques of the martial art. The martial art is what it is because of the training methods, the training tools, as much as they are the techniques.
Yeah.
The training methods of judo changed when he started making it more sportive so that they could roll harder with less dangerous techniques. And the methods are different from wrestling, or the training tools, I should say, are different from wrestling because they're wearing a gi. But if you were to take a wrestler and give him a judo gi and made him grapple for 10 years, he's now doing judo, basically. And if you took a judo player and took that gi off, he's now doing wrestling. Like the things that differentiate all of the different martial arts systems of the world are mostly the methods and the tools. That's it. Not the techniques, but the methods and the tools.
And you know what I find most interesting nowadays, especially since the YouTube revolution, is that really the tool that's changing grappling around the world nowadays is the internet. And
absolutely,
if you think about this, it's like before, this whole story so far has been basically a big story of a knowledge tree branching out from lineage. You know, you can trace that tree back. There's lots of ways to see who came from where, who learned from whom, so on and so forth. But now we're getting into this interesting age of ubiquity where you can just go online and start learning from people that have no actual fingerprint on your life specifically, who've never met you, who couldn't pick you out in a crowd, but you just learned a move from them. Now, at this point, things get really murky, in my opinion, if you want to start claiming pure lineage. Because for anyone to go online and start learning and training from, say, I'm going to learn from AOJ, I'm going to learn from Mendez Brothers, I'm going to learn from Marcelo Garcia, I'm going to learn from Buchecha. You can do this. You can do this with ease for like affordable prices on a monthly basis and get literally top of the line training techniques that can be forwarded to you. You can learn and practice with other people. And now, would you say that your lineage is theirs? Well, not really. You learn some moves from them. But if you were to get to the point that you become a savvy, masterful practitioner a decade or two down the line, like you actually have their knowledge built into your system. So at that point, whose lineage comes from whom's, and does it really matter anymore?
You're preaching to the choir, man. That's exactly how I feel, the exact same way. It's
I think that this is probably the overarching story and the moral, I guess, of the story that you could take away from this is that, as you're saying, it's very important to give homage to the people who put down the groundwork, the pioneers and the forerunners of our styles and of the specific ways that we got the information that we got. But it's getting to the point that really, like, the human body only moves in so many ways, and it's only limited by the knowledge of how to move it. And that knowledge is now becoming, it's in the air. You know, you can go online, you can learn stuff in all sorts of ways. You can travel around if you want to. I've got a student of mine who's going down to California next week, and he's going to train with some, top-notch trainers down there and probably bring back a technique or two that he'd never seen before. Anybody can
Yep.
do that now.
Yep. Whereas even back in the, like we were saying, the late 80s, I mean, Horion had a hell of a time. There was no internet back then.
Mm-hmm.
He literally people had to call him. They had to get a number, call him, pick it up, come to my garage. It's not like that. And that's even infinitely better than it was in ancient Japan. So yeah, though, and the more you read about, the more you learn about the history of something, the less magic there is in it. And I know that some people like magic. They like mythology. Even that shit we were talking about, how the belt system and how, you drag your belt around and it gets darker. Yeah, keep telling that to people. But the truth is that it came from swimming.
Mm-hmm.
And when you demystify something, I feel empowered by it personally.
Same.
I feel that when you demystify something, you learn something, and you can now push that belt system thing aside and focus on not the peripheral bullshit, but what really the martial arts are about. So many people, they think, I trained under this master, who trained under that master, who trained under that master, and things have been done the exact same way ever since, blah, 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 blah. No. If you look at the history, you can see that the jiu-jitsu that we train today is nothing like the jiu-jitsu that was trained by the samurai. Like I said, they had daggers in their hands when they were doing it 200 years ago. Why would they? We don't use daggers when we're doing jiu-jitsu anymore. They weren't doing barimbolos. We weren't doing barimbolos 20 years ago. In the Mundials, they weren't doing barimbolos 20 years ago. Is a barimbolo a jiu-jitsu technique?
Yes, it is. It's actually a Portuguese word that means scramble.
Right. But is it a jiu-jitsu technique? Is it a jiu-jitsu technique as in, was it jiu-jitsu as in like the Japanese art of grappling dating back hundreds of years ago?
No, likely not that far.
Exactly.
I think they found traces of a very similar, if not the same technique, like early Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. They called it something else. I want to say it was like a tornado sweep or something like that.
I actually heard about that.
Yeah, before the tornado sweep that Cyborg has popularized now. But I think for me, what really drew me to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as an art, because I had been doing martial arts for roughly 5 years before I came across Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I had done karate for 3 years and I'd done Kali for 2. And the thing that drew me to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was the truth of it. It was that you know that it works because you use it every class, and you not only see it working, but you make it work and your opponent admits defeat. You don't, have a referee that's saying, oh yeah, that punch was close enough, so that works. No, the person that you're using against says, yes, you got me, you beat me, and now let's do it again. There's truth. There's reality involved in that. And I think
there's no magic in it.
Yes, and this is what you're saying. But it feels like
magic.
This is what you were saying with the history, and why it's so interesting to me and why it strikes so deeply in me is that I want to know the truth of these things. I love seeing, like, being that detective, seeing what actually happened hundreds of years ago.
Exactly. Demystify it. And when that's exactly why I say it makes me feel empowered, because it takes a lot of the things that we deem holy in the world of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the world of martial arts in general. We hold these things, certain things we hold on a pedestal that we ought not hold on a pedestal. Who taught who, what did what, where did this technique come from? Ultimately, we do martial arts, like we do jiu-jitsu. Most people, I think, they start it because they want to learn how to defend themselves, or they want to get in better shape. They stick with it because they see that it's developing them in a better way, positively. And 5 years go by and you're still doing it. Why? Because it's fun. Like it's really fun, and I don't want to stop because it's more than just a hobby now. It's like a lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start, I think as soon as you start saying, well, this lineage is connected to this, and this is for that, and you start talking about things that are kind of peripheral and bullshit, that's when you start getting those McDojo phenomenons.
Yeah, it's the way that people can hide behind their appeal to authority. You can, all you have to say is,
absolutely,
I am a such and such black belt, and you don't even have to roll now. I'm not saying this happens.
Which Gracie is that then?
Yeah, yeah. I'm not saying that this is necessarily happening in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, at least not to a great extent, but you can see it peripherally in other styles. Like you see it,
Mm,
you would know better than I would how bad it's gotten in karate.
very bad.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Like
really, really bad.
talk about appeal to authority. You've got 12-year-old black belts.
Yeah. Oh God. Don't even get me started about that, man. But yeah, exactly. And I don't see jujitsu doing that. What I do see jujitsu doing, if I were to like critique jujitsu and like where it's going, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's that when people do jujitsu, like I was saying, they usually start for self-defense. When they get into the sport aspect of it, people are introducing things into the sport that are no longer really in the realm of martial arts from a combat perspective. Like we mentioned the berimbolo. Now, I suppose that you could do a berimbolo in the UFC or in MMA, and it probably has been done. I know, but it's just not a very practical move to do in a real fighting scenario.
Hmm.
But it is pretty practical to do in IBJJF under IBJJF rules as a means of sweeping, taking the back, whatever. So because jujitsu has become a sport, it is now removing itself from MMA. And now, like in the 90s, I suppose if you were a Brazilian jiu-jitsu guy, there's a good chance you were kind of in the Vale Tudo MMA range.
For sure.
And now they're moving away from that range because they've solidified themselves as a sport, and they're becoming more and more and more of a sport.
Hmm.
What happened to judo was exactly that. They continued to add rules. And the more rules they added, the less of a martial art it became and the more of an Olympic sport it became. Karate had the exact same way. In
Hmm.
karate, they used to fight full contact. There was like broken noses and
Hmm.
blood. And now you draw blood, in some tournaments you get disqualified. They've added these rules, and it reduces the practicality of the martial art. So if I had any if I had any issues with the way the way that jiu-jitsu is going now, it's with the sport, and it's going away from the self-defense. I always think that martial arts should be studied first and foremost for the sake of self-defense. But that's not to say that I don't think that Brazilian jiu-jitsu is still effective for self-defense, because you could be a guy like Rodolfo Vieira, for example, who is a really good at sport jiu-jitsu. That doesn't mean he can't fight in a street fight.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm just saying that sometimes the lines start to get blurred between sport and self-defense,
Hmm.
and not everybody knows where the line is.
Yeah, I don't think you have to worry about world champions when it comes to a fisticuff in the street.
Obviously not.
Uh,
Obviously not.
less so in a one-to-one uh, situation. That's never going to be
Well,
a problem.
here's the thing. I was teaching class a little while back, and I was showing Kimura from guard, just old school closed guard. Kimura, you grab the wrist, reach that hand over, finish with the lock. And I had said, because I know from classical jiu-jitsu that I've seen and from like police gun retention videos, that the move can be used as a gun retention technique. Either your gun is on your hip and they're reaching for it, and you block their wrist and you come over and push their arm away while putting them into a kimura, or they've taken you down and they're now reaching for their gun or the knife, which is in their hip or their pocket. You block it. It's the same thing, whether it's in your hip or their hip. They're reaching in this area when they're inside your guard,
Hmm.
and then you're going for that kimura to retain the weapon, right? Or maybe they've reached for the weapon and they're drawing it, and you're pushing that weapon away from you. When I said, and now we're blocking the weapon and they may be reaching for their gun, like half the students in the class laughed, like, I was like, that wasn't a joke. I was actually serious. They could be reaching for their gun. Let's remember, guys, we're doing martial arts for the sake of being martial, like it's a war art. And I'm sure that if the closed guard to kimura was a technique from ancient Japan, that would have been a major thought process for them. Was they're going for their gun, they're going for their sidearm. Now I have to block it, and now it's I just have to submit the opponent. What is a submission really? Is it winning a fight? We think of it as winning a fight, but a kimura is just breaking somebody's arm. It's just breaking their arm. It's not winning the fight necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Chokeholds win fights. Knockouts win fights. Joint locks don't, unless suddenly the person just pussies right out and gives up, which even the wimpiest of people won't give up a life or death situation when their arm's broken. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, I guess what I'm getting at is that the mindset of the students in the class was purely sport. They were just thinking of the atmosphere and the attitude that we typically take, which is I grab his wrist, I put him in the lock, and I make him tap, and not I'm blocking a weapon or he's trying to get my weapon.
Mm-hmm.
They just didn't even think of that. Now, if you maintain that thought process of the potentials that could take place within a street fight or a self-defense situation, then your jiu-jitsu will be adaptive to that situation. You can adapt it. But if you're not even mentally aware, how are you going to even think about a kimura when someone's going for their knife, say from a clinch position or from inside your guard? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where jiu-jitsu, even the gym I train at, we're on, like, admittedly heavily a sport-oriented gym. We don't really talk about self-defense very often.
Well, I think the good news is that, like you were saying, all of these arts and these techniques come from a foundation that is almost entirely self-defense. So if you change your mindset while you're training them, the techniques are already there for it.
They're
like
mostly
you're saying,
adaptable.
yeah, well, it's like you're saying, you change your mindset to why I'm doing this, and then it makes sense why it works if it were, in a critical situation.
Yeah, that's right. I think so anyway.
Well, man, this has been just the most amazing 2-hour conversation about history, and I can't thank you enough, Logan, for coming on and doing this. It's been a blast, and I hope that, man, I might have a ton of DMs about questions regarding this.
Drew,
I'm gonna
I
point
love
them to
you, buddy, and I will do my best. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, and everyone listening, thanks again for another episode of You, Me, and Us. We'll see you on the next one.
Os.